It was during the reception, held in the open field behind the church, that he saw her. For a moment, he forgot about the feud, about the invisible walls that divided their families. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, reality crept back in. "I should go," Emily said. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was the beginning of something that would change his life forever, though he couldn't yet imagine the cost. A chance encounter. The next day, he couldn't stop thinking about Emily, her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, and as he reached the corner cafe, there she was. "Ethan, right. From the wedding. That's me." He gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Mind it, Emily," Henry said, his voice cold. "We need to talk." Emily froze, her heart sinking. "About what?" "About Ethan Connor." Henry spat the name like poison. Her blood ran cold as she shot a glare at Caleb. "You told him." "I had to," Caleb said defensively, his voice rising. "You're sneaking around with the enemy, Emily." Till the end of the horizon. Chapter 1. Shadows of the Past. The town of Clearwater, Wyoming, was a place where stories lingered like whispers in the wind. Tucked between sprawling cattle ranches and fields that seemed to stretch into forever, Clearwater had two constants: its breathtaking sunsets and the bitter feud between the Connors and the Martins. For as long as anyone could remember, the Connors ranch and the Martins farm had stood as symbols of prosperity and rivalry. It started decades ago, over something as trivial as a property line dispute. That argument had turned to anger, then lawsuits, and eventually spilled over into violence. By the time the courts resolved the issue, both families had lost loved ones. From then on, the feud became a legacy, passed down like family heirlooms. John Connor, the head of the Connor family, was a man of tradition. Rugged and imposing, his life revolved around the cattle business and keeping the Martin family at bay. On the other side of the divide stood Henry Martin, equally stubborn and proud, who had transformed his farm into a thriving organic produce business. Neither man had spoken to the other in over 30 years, but their mutual disdain was as fresh as the morning dew. It was into this world that Ethan Connor was born, a world of expectations and unspoken rules. But Ethan was not like his father. Where John saw honor in tradition, Ethan saw confinement. He'd grown up on the ranch, learning to rope cattle and mend fences, but his heart lay elsewhere. Music was his escape. By the time he was 16, he could play the guitar better than most professionals, and his room was filled with notebooks scribbled with lyrics and melodies. Ethan's dream was to leave Clearwater, to head to Los Angeles and make a name for himself. But every time he mentioned it, his father would scoff. "You can't live off dreams, boy," John would say, his voice heavy with disappointment. "This ranch is your legacy." That summer, Ethan found himself back in Clearwater, reluctantly attending the wedding of his cousin, Clara. The entire town seemed to have turned up, dressed in their Sunday best, the church filled with the hum of conversations and the occasional burst of laughter. Ethan sat near the back, fiddling with the cuff of his shirt and counting down the minutes until he could leave. It was during the reception, held in the open field behind the church, that he saw her. Emily Martin was radiant. She wasn't dressed to impress. Her simple floral sundress swayed in the summer breeze, but there was an air about her that drew people in. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight, and her laughter was infectious. Ethan watched as she moved through the crowd, her camera in hand, capturing moments that others might have missed. For a moment, he forgot about the feud, about the invisible walls that divided their families. She was just a girl, and he was just a boy, caught in a fleeting moment of wonder. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" she said, startling him. He hadn't realized she'd noticed him watching. Ethan stammered, feeling uncharacteristically shy. Yeah, it is." She smiled, tilting her head slightly. "You're not much for weddings, are you?" "Not really. I'm Ethan, by the way." "Emily," she replied, extending her hand. They shook hands, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt as though the weight of Clearwater's history had been lifted. They talked for what felt like hours, about everything and nothing. She told him about her passion for photography, how she wanted to travel and capture the world's hidden beauty. He shared his dreams of playing his songs on big stages, far away from the ranch and its suffocating expectations. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, reality crept back in. "I should go," Emily said, her voice tinged with regret. "Will I see you again?" Ethan asked, his heart pounding. "Maybe," she said with a smile that lingered long after she'd disappeared into the crowd. As Ethan watched her go, he knew he was in trouble. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was the beginning of something that would change his life forever, though he couldn't yet imagine the cost. Chapter 2. A Chance Encounter. The next day, Clearwater buzzed with the aftermath of the wedding. People traded stories over coffee at the diner or exchanged knowing smiles as they passed each other on Main Street. For Ethan Connor, however, the day was marked by a quiet anticipation. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily, her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, and the calm certainty in her voice. By late afternoon, Ethan found himself wandering into town, guitar slung over his shoulder. The small square in the heart of Clearwater was bustling with life, kids darting in and out of stores, a group of old-timers debating politics near the gas station, and tourists snapping pictures of the rustic charm. He didn't know why he was there, only that he couldn't sit on the ranch any longer. As he reached the corner cafe, there she was. Emily sat at an outdoor table, her camera resting on the wooden surface beside a half-finished cup of coffee. She was flipping through her photos, her brows furrowed in concentration. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then summoned the courage to approach. "Working on something?" he asked casually, as though they'd known each other for years. Emily looked up, startled, then broke into a smile. "Ethan, right. From the wedding." "That's me." He gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I join?" "Not at all," she said, sliding her camera aside. They talked easily, their conversation picking up where it had left off the day before. Emily explained her fascination with photography, how she loved capturing the little details most people overlooked. She showed him a few of her shots from the wedding: laughing children, a shy bride peeking out from behind a curtain, and a lone cowboy silhouetted against the sunset. "These are incredible," Ethan said sincerely. "You have a way of seeing things most people don't." "Thanks," Emily said, her cheeks flushing. "What about you? Do you still write songs?" Ethan nodded. "All the time. It's the only thing that makes sense to me. I love this town, but I feel like I'm drowning here. Music's my way out." Emily studied him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "You're not like the others around here, are you?" "Guess not," Ethan admitted with a shrug. "What about you? You don't seem like the type to settle down in Clearwater either." She laughed softly. "No, I'm not. I want to see the world. New York, Paris, Tokyo. There's so much out there, and I don't want to miss it." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the shared dreams hanging between them. It was Emily who broke it, glancing at her watch and sighing. "I should head home," she said reluctantly. "Let me walk you," Ethan offered, surprising even himself. Emily hesitated, then smiled. "All right." They strolled through the quiet streets of Clearwater, their steps unhurried as the golden glow of evening bathed the town. They talked about everything: favorite songs, books they'd read, places they wanted to visit. It was only when they reached the edge of town that Ethan realized where they were headed. The Martins' farm lay just a mile down the road. Ethan stopped, his pulse quickening. "Emily, wait." She turned, her brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" I think there's something you should know," he began, struggling to find the words. "My last name's Connor." For a moment, Emily just stared at him. Then she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You're joking, right?" "I wish I was," Ethan said quietly. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of disbelief. So, what? You're part of the Connor family. The same Connors who've spent decades hating my family. Yeah, Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But that doesn't change anything, does it? Emily shook her head, taking a step back. You don't get it, Ethan. Our families, they've been at war forever. My dad would lose his mind if he knew I was talking to you. Maybe it's time things changed, Ethan said, stepping closer. We don't have to be like them, Emily. We can be better. She looked at him, torn between her heart and her history. Finally, she sighed. I need to think about this. I need time. Ethan nodded, though every fiber of his being wanted to convince her to stay. I get it. Just don't shut me out, okay? She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes gave him hope. As Emily turned and walked away, Ethan stood there, watching her disappear into the twilight. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't letting her go without a fight. Chapter 3. A growing bond. Days turned into weeks, but Emily's thoughts remained clouded with the weight of her last conversation with Ethan. The revelation of his last name, Connor, felt like a cruel twist of fate. Every instinct told her to walk away, to avoid the conflict and heartbreak their connection would inevitably bring. And yet, her heart betrayed her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his earnest gaze, heard the quiet determination in his voice. Ethan, too, couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. He had spent most of his life avoiding confrontations with his father, but this was different. Emily wasn't just another passing thought or dream, she was a force that ignited something in him. It was on a late Sunday afternoon that their paths crossed again. Emily had been out photographing the wildflowers blooming near the edge of town, her escape from the world's complexities. She was crouched near a cluster of bluebells, angling her camera for the perfect shot, when a shadow fell over her. Need help with that? Startled, she turned to find Ethan standing a few feet away, a small, hopeful smile on his face. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice equal parts surprise and exasperation. I was passing by and saw you, he said, shrugging. Thought maybe you could use some company. Emily sighed, lowering her camera. Ethan, we shouldn't. Shouldn't what? He interrupted, stepping closer. Talk. Be friends. Care about each other. It's not that simple, she said, her tone softening. It is, Ethan countered. It's the rest of the world that makes it complicated. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Emily shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. You're relentless, you know that. I've been told, Ethan replied with a grin. So, are you gonna let me walk with you or not? Reluctantly, she nodded, and together they began strolling through the meadow. At first, their conversation was light, favorite foods, embarrassing childhood stories, but soon, it turned deeper. I don't get it, Emily said after a while. Why aren't you angry? Our families hate each other. You should hate me. Ethan shook his head. I don't hate you. I hate what this feud has done to everyone. I mean, do you even know what started it? Emily frowned. Something about land, wasn't it? Exactly. Land. Dirt. Something so trivial, and now it's like this invisible wall we're not supposed to cross. I don't want to live my life like that, Emily. Do you? She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. No, she admitted finally. I don't. But what happens when our families find out? They'll never understand. Then we'll make them, Ethan said, his voice firm. We'll show them there's more to life than holding on to grudges. Emily looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. She found none. You really believe that, don't you? She asked. With everything I have, he said. A quiet warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rise above the history that threatened to tear them apart. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Emily found ways to meet in secret. Sometimes it was at the edge of the meadow, other times in the small park on the outskirts of town. Each stolen moment deepened their connection. They laughed, dreamed, and even argued, but each encounter left them more certain of their feelings. Ethan brought his guitar one evening, playing a soft melody as Emily leaned against a tree, listening intently. "That's beautiful," she said when he finished. "It's for you," he admitted, his cheeks turning red. "I mean, it's not finished yet, but, yeah." Emily felt her heart swell. No one had ever done anything like that for her before. "You're amazing, you know that," she said softly. Ethan grinned. Takes one to know one. But their happiness was not without its shadows. Back at home, John Connor had started to notice his son's frequent absences. One evening, over dinner, he confronted Ethan. "Where have you been sneaking off to?" John asked, his tone sharp. "Nowhere important," Ethan replied casually, though his grip on his fork tightened. "You're lying," John said, leaning forward. "Is there something I need to know, boy?" Ethan met his father's gaze, his jaw set. "No, sir." John narrowed his eyes but let the matter drop, for now. Across town, Henry Martin was growing suspicious as well. Emily's younger brother, Caleb, had seen her leaving the house late one evening and followed her to the park. He didn't see much, but it was enough to plant seeds of doubt. "Who were you with last night?" Caleb asked the next morning, his tone accusatory. "No one," Emily said quickly, avoiding his eyes. "Don't lie to me, Caleb warned. "If Dad finds out you're sneaking around, he's gonna lose it." Emily swallowed hard, but her resolve didn't waver. She wasn't ready to tell anyone about Ethan, not yet. One warm evening, as they sat by the creek that ran through the meadow, Ethan reached for Emily's hand. "I don't want to keep hiding like this," he said. "I know it's risky, but I want to tell them. All of them." Emily's stomach tightened. "Ethan, you don't know what you're asking. My dad, he's not like yours. He's stubborn and proud. He'll never accept us." "Then we'll make them see," Ethan said. "We'll show them what they're fighting against. It's not worth losing each other over, Emily." Tears pricked her eyes, but she nodded. "Okay," she said. "We'll tell them. Together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, they held on to each other, bracing for the storm they knew was coming. Chapter 4. Storm on the horizon. The decision to reveal their relationship weighed heavily on both Ethan and Emily. In the quiet moments they shared, away from prying eyes and the judgments of their families, it felt like the right thing to do. But as the days passed and the reality of their plan loomed closer, doubt crept in like a shadow. Ethan was the first to act. He waited until Sunday evening, when the Connors gathered on the ranch's front porch after dinner. The golden glow of lanterns lit up the wooden beams as John Connor sat in his usual chair, puffing on a cigar, while Ethan's mother, Margaret, knitted quietly nearby. "Dad, there's something I need to talk to you about," Ethan said, standing at the edge of the porch steps. John glanced up, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "It's about someone I've been seeing. Her name is Emily." "Emily who?" John asked, already suspicious. Ethan took a deep breath. "Emily Martin." The silence that followed was deafening. John's cigar fell from his fingers, landing on the wooden planks. "Martin," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, sir," Ethan said firmly, though his pulse raced. John stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floorboards. "Are you out of your damn mind? Do you know what you're saying, boy?" Martin." "She's not the enemy, Dad," Ethan argued, stepping closer. "She's just a girl, a smart, kind, amazing girl who has nothing to do with whatever feud you've been holding on to for decades." John's face turned red with anger. "That feud, as you call it, is about respect, about protecting what's ours. And you're throwing it all away for some girl." Margaret intervened, placing a calming hand on John's arm. "Let him explain, John. Maybe we should hear him out." John shook her off, his eyes blazing. "There's nothing to explain. No son of mine is going to shame this family by running off with a Martin. I'm not running off, Ethan shot back, his voice rising. I'm trying to build something better, something that doesn't revolve around hate. But John wasn't listening. He stormed inside, slamming the door behind him. Across town, Emily was having an equally tense conversation with her father. Henry Martin was in the barn, fixing a broken fence post, when Emily found him. The air smelled of hay and sawdust, and the rhythmic sound of hammering echoed through the space. "Dad, can we talk?" Emily asked, stepping into the barn. "Make it quick, Em. I've got work to finish," Henry said without looking up. "It's important," she said, her voice trembling. Henry finally set down the hammer and turned to her, wiping his hands on a rag. "All right, what is it?" Emily drew in a shaky breath. "I've been seeing someone. His name is Ethan." Henry frowned. "Ethan who?" "Ethan Connor," she said softly. The rag slipped from Henry's hands. For a moment, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face hardened. "A Connor," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Yes," Emily said, standing her ground. "I know how it sounds, but Ethan isn't like his father. He's kind, and he understands me in a way no one else does." Henry shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? This isn't just about you, Emily. This is about our family, our history. You think you can just ignore all that?" "I'm not ignoring it," Emily said, her voice rising. "But I refuse to let it dictate my life. I love him, Dad. And nothing you say is going to change that." Henry's face darkened. "If you think I'm going to stand by and let this happen, you're wrong. That boy is poison, just like his father." Emily felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to back down. "You don't even know him. And I don't need to," Henry snapped. "You'll end this, Emily. Do you hear me? You'll end it, or you can forget about living under my roof." Emily recoiled, the weight of his words crashing over her. "Is that what you want? To lose your daughter over a grudge you can't even justify anymore?" Henry turned away, his shoulders stiff. "Go to your room, Emily. We're done talking." Chapter 5. Lines drawn in the sand. The figure watching from the edge of the meadow was Caleb Martin, Emily's younger brother. His face was a mix of confusion and fury, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He had followed Emily, curious about her increasingly secretive behavior, and now, standing there in the shadow of the trees, he felt betrayed. Caleb didn't wait to hear the rest of their conversation. He turned and stalked back toward town, his thoughts racing. That evening, as Emily returned home, she found her father waiting in the living room, his expression dark and unreadable. Caleb sat nearby, avoiding her gaze. "Emily," Henry said, his voice cold. "We need to talk." Emily froze, her heart sinking. "About what?" "About Ethan Connor." Henry spat the name like poison. Her blood ran cold as she shot a glare at Caleb. "You told him." "I had to," Caleb said defensively, his voice rising. "You're sneaking around with the enemy, Emily. What was I supposed to do?" "I trusted you," she snapped, her voice cracking. "Enough," Henry roared, silencing them both. He stood and towered over Emily, his eyes blazing with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That boy's family has been trying to ruin us for years, and now you're cozying up to him." "Dad, it's not like that," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Ethan isn't like his father. Don't you dare defend him." Henry interrupted. "You will end this, Emily, or so help me, you're out of this house." Tears streamed down her face, but she stood her ground. "I love him, Dad. And I'm not going to apologize for that." Henry's face turned crimson with anger. "Then you've made your choice. Pack your things and get out." Meanwhile, at the Connor ranch, Ethan was facing his own battle. John Connor had summoned his older brothers, Greg and Darren, to the house, and they sat around the dining table, their expressions grim. "This nonsense stops now," John said, slamming his fist on the table. That Martin girl is a threat to everything we've built. Ethan needs to be reminded where his loyalties lie. Ethan stood in the doorway, his jaw clenched as he listened. I don't need reminding, he said, stepping into the room. But you do. This isn't about land or pride anymore. It's about your stubborn refusal to let go of the past. Watch your tone, boy, Greg warned, his voice low and dangerous. No. I'm done watching my tone, Ethan shot back. Emily and I are leaving, and there's nothing any of you can do to stop us. John's face twisted with rage. If you walk out that door, you're no son of mine. Ethan's heart ached at the words, but he didn't waver. Then I guess I'm not. Ethan and Emily met at the usual spot in the meadow later that night, their breaths visible in the crisp autumn air. They know, Emily said, her voice shaking. My dad threw me out. Mine too, Ethan admitted, pulling her into a tight embrace. What do we do now? She whispered. We leave, Ethan said firmly. Tonight. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. I packed a bag. It's all I could carry. Me too, Ethan said. I've got some money saved up. It's not much, but it'll get us started. They exchanged a look, the determination mirrored in each other's eyes. Let's go, Ethan said, taking her hand. They walked through the meadow under the cover of darkness, the stars their only witnesses. Neither spoke, but the grip on each other's hands was unyielding. Unbeknownst to them, Caleb wasn't the only one who had been spying. Greg Connor had followed Ethan earlier that evening, suspicious of his brother's plans. He watched from a distance as Ethan and Emily disappeared into the woods, a cruel smile playing on his lips. By dawn, Ethan and Emily had reached the bus station on the outskirts of Clearwater. They pulled their money and bought 2 tickets to Chicago, a city far enough away to start over. As they boarded the bus, Ethan glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see their families charging after them. But the station was empty, save for a lone attendant and a sleepy traveler waiting on a bench. They settled into their seats, their fingers intertwined. For the first time in days, they allowed themselves to hope. We're doing the right thing, Emily said softly, leaning her head on Ethan's shoulder. We are, Ethan agreed, though the weight of the decision still pressed heavily on him. The bus pulled out of the station, its headlights cutting through the early morning fog. As Clearwater faded into the distance, neither Ethan nor Emily noticed the dark SUV parked across the street, its engine idling. Inside sat Greg Connor, his phone pressed to his ear. They're headed to Chicago, he said tersely. What do you want me to do? The voice on the other end of the line was cold and unrelenting. Follow them. This isn't over. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 6. Shadows in the City. Ethan and Emily arrived in Chicago just as the city was beginning to stir. The sun's first rays pierced the gray skyline, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. For a moment, the sheer size of the city made them feel invisible, 2 small figures swallowed by a sea of concrete and glass. This is it, Ethan said, stepping off the bus and looking around. A new start. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag, her eyes scanning their surroundings. It's overwhelming. We'll figure it out, Ethan assured her, reaching for her hand. Together, they spent the morning navigating the city, eventually finding a modest motel tucked away in a quieter neighborhood. The room was far from luxurious, peeling wallpaper and a creaky bed frame, but it was theirs. As they unpacked, Emily glanced at Ethan, her heart swelling with gratitude. Despite everything they had left behind, she felt safer with him than she ever had in her father's house. What now? She asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Ethan tossed his duffel bag into the corner and sat beside her. We find jobs, save up, and get a place of our own. It won't be easy, but we'll make it work. Emily nodded, drawing strength from his resolve. I believe in us. While Ethan and Emily settled into their new life, Greg Connor had been trailing them. He checked into a hotel a few blocks from their motel and spent the next 2 days quietly observing their movements. His phone buzzed late one evening. It was John Connor. Any updates? John's voice was gruff, laced with impatience. They're trying to blend in, Greg said. Found a cheap motel and have been laying low. John growled on the other end. I don't care how low they're laying. We can't let this stand. They're a disgrace to the Connor name. Don't worry, Greg replied, his lips curling into a smirk. I've got a plan to bring them back, and make sure they regret ever leaving. Oblivious to the looming threat, Ethan and Emily began piecing together their lives. Ethan found work as a delivery driver for a local pizzeria, while Emily landed a part-time job at a small bookstore. The days were long, and their nights were filled with whispered conversations about the future. One evening, as they walked home from the bookstore, Emily paused outside a small diner, her eyes lighting up. Let's get something to eat. My treat. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Your treat. Big spender already. Emily laughed. It's just burgers, Ethan. Don't get used to it. They slid into a booth near the window, the smell of greasy food and coffee filling the air. For the first time in weeks, they felt a semblance of normalcy. You know, Ethan said, taking a sip of his soda, I've been thinking. Maybe we could open a little shop someday. You could sell books, and I could sell guitars or something. Emily's eyes sparkled. That sounds perfect. But their moment of peace was short-lived. Across the street, Greg sat in his car, watching them through the diner's window. His expression was cold, calculating. The next morning, Emily arrived at the bookstore to find her boss, Mrs. Whitaker, waiting with a worried look. Emily, dear, I need to speak with you, she said, gesturing toward the back office. Emily followed, her heart sinking. Is something wrong? Mrs. Whitaker sighed, wringing her hands. I received a call this morning from someone claiming to know you. They said unpleasant things. Emily's stomach churned. What kind of things? That you're trouble, Mrs. Whitaker said hesitantly. That you're running away from something. I don't know what's true, but I can't have any disruptions here. I'm sorry, Emily, but I think it's best if you find work elsewhere. Tears stung Emily's eyes as she nodded. I understand. When Emily returned to the motel, Ethan was waiting, his face lighting up when he saw her. Hey, how was work? He asked, but his smile faded when he saw her expression. What happened? Emily sank onto the bed, her hands trembling. I got fired. Someone called and they ruined it, Ethan. They said I was trouble. Ethan's jaw tightened. It was them. It had to be. Emily looked up, fear etched into her face. What if they're here, Ethan? What if they find us? They won't, Ethan said firmly, though doubt gnawed at him. I won't let them. That night, Ethan stayed up long after Emily had fallen asleep. He sat by the window, his eyes scanning the street below for any sign of danger. His mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. He was still awake when he saw a familiar figure step out of the shadows. Greg. Ethan's blood boiled as he watched his brother linger near the motel's entrance, smoking a cigarette and looking far too pleased with himself. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed his jacket and slipped out of the room, careful not to wake Emily. Greg was leaning against a lamppost when Ethan approached, his hands balled into fists. What the hell are you doing here? Ethan demanded, his voice low but furious. Greg smirked, flicking the cigarette to the ground. Nice to see you too, little brother. Answer me, Greg, Ethan said, stepping closer. I'm here to bring you home, Greg said casually. Dad's orders. I'm not going back, Ethan said through clenched teeth. And neither is Emily. Greg's smirk faded, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. You really think you can just walk away from all this? From us? You're a Connor, Ethan, whether you like it or not. And that girl of yours, she's nothing but a liability. Don't you dare talk about her like that, Ethan growled. Greg took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're making a mistake, kid. Walk away from her now, or I promise, things will get ugly. Ethan's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. If you so much as look at her again, Greg, I'll make sure you regret it. Greg chuckled darkly. We'll see about that. As Greg walked away, Ethan felt the weight of the situation settle over him. The city no longer felt like a safe haven. The shadows that followed them were growing darker, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before they were forced to make their stand. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 7. The Gathering Storm. Ethan didn't sleep that night. After his confrontation with Greg, the threat felt too real to ignore. He returned to the motel room to find Emily still asleep, her face serene in the soft glow of the streetlight filtering through the window. He sat by her side, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. For a fleeting moment, he thought about waking her, about telling her what had just happened. But what could he say that wouldn't shatter the fragile sense of peace they had been clinging to? Instead, he resolved to protect her, no matter the cost. The next morning, Emily woke to find Ethan already dressed, his face drawn and pale. "Ethan, are you okay?" she asked, sitting up. He hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. I just couldn't sleep. Figured I'd get an early start." Emily narrowed her eyes. "You're lying to me." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Greg was here last night." Her blood ran cold. What? What did he say?" "He wants me to come back." "Us to come back," Ethan said, his jaw tightening. "And he made it clear that if we don't, things are going to get worse." Emily's hand flew to her mouth. "Ethan, what are we going to do?" "We stay strong," he said, sitting beside her. "We don't let them scare us into going back." "But what if they find us again?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Then we fight. Together." The couple spent the day preparing for the possibility of being found. Ethan visited the pizzeria where he worked, asking his manager for a paycheck advance. After some convincing, he left with just enough cash to book a different motel on the opposite side of the city. Emily, meanwhile, packed their belongings and made sure they left no trace of their stay. By nightfall, they were on the move again, weaving through Chicago's busy streets until they reached their new temporary home, a slightly cleaner, slightly larger room in a nondescript building. "Do you think this will work?" Emily asked as they sat together on the lumpy bed. "It has to," Ethan said, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. But the reprieve was short-lived. Greg wasn't working alone. Back in Clearwater, Caleb Martin had been roped into the pursuit. "I'm not comfortable with this," Caleb told his father as they loaded up the truck. Henry shot him a sharp look. "You started this by telling me about them, Caleb. If you want to make it right, you'll do as I say. But chasing 'em down like this, it feels wrong," Caleb said, his voice faltering. Henry's expression hardened. "The Connors aren't going to make fools of us. Now get in the truck." 3 days passed before trouble found Ethan and Emily again. They were walking home from the grocery store, their bags heavy with canned goods and essentials, when Ethan's instincts flared. "Emily," he said quietly, "don't look, but I think we're being followed." Emily froze. "What do we do?" "Just keep walking," he said, his voice steady. "Act normal." As they neared the corner of their street, Ethan glanced over his shoulder. Sure enough, Greg and another man he didn't recognize were trailing him, their expressions predatory. "Run," Ethan whispered, dropping the bags. Without hesitation, Emily grabbed his hand, and they took off, darting through the crowded sidewalks. Shouts erupted behind him as Greg and his accomplice gave chase. The streets blurred as Ethan and Emily sprinted through the city, weaving between pedestrians and dodging traffic. Adrenaline coursed through their veins as they turned corner after corner, desperately trying to lose their pursuers. Finally, they ducked into an alley, pressing themselves against the wall as they struggled to catch their breath. "I think we lost them," Ethan said, though his voice was shaky. Emily clung to his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "This isn't going to stop, is it?" "No," Ethan admitted, his heart sinking. Not unless we make it stop. Back at the motel, Ethan began formulating a plan. We can't keep running, he said, pacing the room. It's only a matter of time before they catch up with us again. Then what do we do? Emily asked, her voice small. Ethan stopped, his gaze intense. We fight back, not with violence, but by exposing the truth about them, the hate, the grudges, all of it. We show the world what our families have become. Emily blinked, taken aback. How? No one's going to listen to us. We make them listen, Ethan said, determination hardening his features. We write our story. We tell the truth about what we've been through, and we share it with anyone who will read it. Emily hesitated, but then she nodded. Okay, let's do it. Over the next several days, Ethan and Emily poured their hearts into their story, writing late into the night on a second-hand laptop Ethan had managed to buy. They recounted everything: the feud, their forbidden love, the threats, and their flight from Clearwater. As they worked, they began to feel a flicker of hope. By putting their story into words, they were reclaiming their narrative, refusing to let their families define their future. But they didn't know that Greg and Henry were closing in, their patience wearing thin. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 8. Allies in the Shadows. The following morning, Ethan and Emily made their way to a small public library in a quieter neighborhood of Chicago. With their story partially written, they needed a way to share it with the world, an idea that both terrified and invigorated them. Ethan leaned over Emily's shoulder as she typed on the library computer. If we can post this on enough forums and social media platforms, someone's bound to notice. Maybe even journalists or advocacy groups. Emily nodded but hesitated. What if it backfires? What if our families use it against us? They're already hunting us, Ethan said firmly. This is our best shot at exposing the truth before they can silence us. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Okay, let's do it. As they worked, an older man seated a few tables away caught sight of their intense expressions. His curiosity piqued. He approached cautiously, his wiry frame draped in a worn blazer. Excuse me, he said, his voice gentle. I couldn't help but notice your urgency. Is everything all right? Ethan and Emily exchanged a wary glance. We're fine, Ethan said tersely. But the man smiled kindly. I don't mean to pry. I'm a retired journalist, and old habits die hard. If there's a story you're trying to tell, I might be able to help. Emily's eyes widened. You're a journalist. Used to be, the man said, pulling out a battered notebook from his pocket. Name's Frank Adler. Spent 30 years covering stories most folks didn't want told. Ethan hesitated, his instincts telling him to be cautious, but Emily spoke up. We're running from our families, she said. They've been feuding for years, and now they're trying to tear us apart because we chose each other. Frank raised an eyebrow. Feuding families. Sounds like something out of Shakespeare. It's real, Ethan said. And it's dangerous. They've followed us here, and we don't know what they'll do next. Frank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You're brave for standing up to them. If you're willing to trust me, I can help you get your story out there. Later that evening, Frank met Ethan and Emily at their motel, his voice a steadying force as he listened to their tale. This isn't just about two families, Frank said after they finished recounting their ordeal. It's about breaking a cycle of hate that's consumed generations. People need to hear this. Emily's eyes glistened with tears. But will they care? We're just two people. Every movement starts with a few brave souls, Frank said. Your story has the power to inspire others to stand against division and prejudice. Ethan's jaw tightened with resolve. Then let's do it. Let's make them listen. Over the next few days, Frank helped the couple refine their narrative, weaving in the historical roots of the Martin Connor feud and the toll it had taken on both families. Together, they crafted an article that was equal parts raw and hopeful, urging readers to see beyond the hate and embrace love and understanding. Frank used his connections to pitch the story to local news outlets, and within a week, it caught the attention of a prominent Chicago newspaper. Meanwhile, Greg and Henry had tracked Ethan and Emily to the new motel. They parked across the street, watching the couple come and go. "We need to end this," Greg muttered. "Tonight." Henry nodded grimly. "We'll confront them after sundown." That evening, Ethan, Emily, and Frank were preparing to send their final draft to the newspaper when the door to their motel room burst open. Greg and Henry stormed in, their faces twisted with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Henry barked, his eyes locking onto Emily. "Dad, don't. Dad. Me." Henry snapped. "You've brought shame to our family, Emily. And now you're airing our dirty laundry to the world." Greg shoved Ethan against the wall. "You think you're some kind of hero. You're just a selfish kid who doesn't know his place. Back off, Greg," Ethan growled, shoving him away. Frank stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Enough. If you lay another hand on him, I'll call the police." Henry sneered. "And who are you?" "A journalist," Frank said evenly. "And I have no problem documenting this little reunion for the authorities." The threat gave Henry pause, but Greg was less easily deterred. "You think you can just write your way out of this? No one's going to care about your sob story." "Maybe not," Ethan said, his voice steady, "but they'll care about the truth. And you won't be able to control the fallout." Greg lunged toward Ethan, but Henry grabbed his arm. "Enough," he said, his voice low. "We'll handle this our way." As they left, Henry turned to Emily, his expression cold. "You've made your choice. Don't expect us to clean up your mess." After they were gone, Emily collapsed into Ethan's arms, her body trembling. "What if they come back?" "We won't be here," Ethan said. "Frank's right. We need to go public. It's the only way to protect ourselves." Frank nodded. "Once the story is out, they'll lose the upper hand. People will rally around you." Ethan and Emily exchanged a glance, their fear giving way to determination. "Let's do it," Emily said, her voice steady. "Let's tell the world." Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 9. Voices in the Wind. Ethan and Emily woke up the next morning to the sunlight streaming through the motel window, but there was no comfort in the brightness. The events of the previous night lingered like a shadow, heavy and oppressive. Yet, a glimmer of hope shone in the form of Frank Adler. Their article, now polished and powerful, was ready for submission. Ethan and Emily read through it one last time, their hands trembling as they realized this would soon be in the hands of the public. "When hate defines generations, love becomes an act of rebellion," Emily read aloud from the opening line. Ethan placed a hand over hers. "It's perfect. It's us." Frank leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his notepad. "I've sent it to the Chicago Tribune and a few independent media outlets. It's only a matter of time before someone publishes it." Emily's eyes were filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Frank. We couldn't have done this without you." Frank waved it off with a small smile. "I've seen enough injustice in my career to know when it's time to step in. The rest is up to you too." 2 days later, Ethan and Emily were walking back from the corner store when Ethan's phone buzzed. It was Frank. "It's Liv," he said simply. "What?" Ethan stopped in his tracks, clutching the phone. The Tribune picked it up. "It's on their website and social media. Your story's out there." Emily gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. "Are people reading it?" "Oh. They're reading it," Frank replied. "The comments are flooding in. People are rallying behind you." Ethan hung up, and the couple rushed back to the motel to check for themselves. As soon as they opened the article on the Tribune's website, their breath caught. The headline read, "Star-crossed love in America. A couple defies feuding families to rewrite their legacy." Below the headline was a photo Frank had taken of them, Ethan, his arm around Emily, both of them staring defiantly at the camera. The comments section was a whirlwind of reactions. "Their courage is inspiring. We need more people like them." This feud sounds like something out of the 1800s. Grow up, people. Love conquers all. I'm rooting for them. Emily's heart soared as she read the messages of support. They care, she whispered. People actually care. Ethan smiled, his own relief tempered by caution. This is a good start, but it also means our families are going to see it. Miles away in Clearwater, the Connors and Martins were already reeling. John Connor slammed the morning paper onto the dining table, the bold headline staring back at him. Did you know about this? He barked at Greg. Greg snatched the paper, his face darkening as he skimmed the article. They're trying to make us look like villains. You are villains, snapped Rose Connor, who had been quietly reading the article. You've hunted them like animals instead of trying to understand them. John's face turned red. Don't you start, Rose. But Rose stood her ground. I've had enough, John. This feud has taken everything from us. Now it's about to take Ethan, too, because you're too proud to let it go. The article also reached Henry Martin, whose reaction was predictably explosive. They're airing our business to the whole country. He roared, slamming his fist against the table. But Caleb, who had been silently reading the comments online, saw things differently. People are supporting them, Dad. They're calling out the hate. Henry glared at him. You're siding with them now. I'm siding with what's right, Caleb said quietly, setting down his phone. While the feud stirred back in Clearwater, the article began drawing attention from advocacy groups and social justice organizations in Chicago. Ethan and Emily received invitations for interviews and offers of support from strangers who had been moved by their story. One organization, Love Beyond Borders, reached out directly. We've read your story, said a representative over the phone. We'd like to help. We can provide legal resources, security, and a platform to share your message more broadly. Emily's eyes filled with tears of relief as she thanked them. Ethan, however, remained on edge. This feels like the calm before the storm, he admitted that evening. Emily touched his arm. We've faced so much already, Ethan. Whatever's coming, we'll handle it together. But the storm wasn't far off. The article's viral reach had stoked the fury of both families, and Greg wasn't about to let Ethan and Emily win without a fight. We need to take this to them, Greg told John. They want to make this public. Fine. Let's show the world who they really are. Henry, on the other hand, was growing more desperate. Caleb had distanced himself, and the public backlash against the Martins was mounting. For the first time, Henry began to wonder if his ironclad control over his family, and his legacy, was slipping away. Back in Chicago, Ethan and Emily's newfound hope was tempered by the knowledge that their families wouldn't let this go. They prepared for the inevitable, leaning on Frank and the connections they had made through their article. As the days passed, the couple began to feel the weight of the fight they had undertaken. But they also felt the strength of the people rallying behind them, strangers who believed in their love and their courage. We're not alone anymore, Emily said one evening, resting her head on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan kissed her forehead. No. We're not. And where the family's confrontation with Ethan and Emily comes to a dramatic head, leading to an emotional resolution. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 10. A Reckoning of Hearts. Ethan and Emily sat in the crowded coffee shop, their hands clasped tightly under the table. Across from them sat two members of Love Beyond Borders, Amanda and Carlos, who had become their strongest allies since the article had gone viral. We've coordinated with local authorities, Amanda said, her voice steady but cautious. If your families try to escalate, we'll make sure you're protected. But we also think it might be time for a direct conversation, on neutral ground, with mediators. Emily stiffened. You're saying we should meet them? Carlos leaned forward. It's a risk, but if they're willing to talk, it could diffuse the situation before it gets worse. Ethan looked at Emily, his expression torn. What do you think? Emily hesitated. The thought of facing her father and Greg sent a chill down her spine, but running forever wasn't an option. If it means we can finally stop this, I'll do it. The meeting was set for the following Saturday in a small community center. Amanda and Carlos would mediate, and Frank would be there as a witness, armed with his notebook and recorder. Ethan and Emily arrived early, their nerves frayed. They sat in a circle of chairs arranged in the center of the room, their hands entwined as they waited. "Whatever happens," Ethan whispered, "we don't back down." Emily nodded. Together, the Connors and Martins entered minutes later, the tension palpable as they took their seats. John Connor, his face lined with anger, stared coldly at Ethan. Beside him sat Greg, who looked ready to pounce. On the other side, Henry Martin's presence was just as imposing, though Caleb's reluctant posture suggested he had been dragged along. Amanda cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Thank you all for coming. This meeting is an opportunity to have an honest, respectful dialogue. The goal is not to rehash old wounds but to find a way forward." "Find a way forward," John scoffed. "These two betrayed their families and dragged our names through the mud." Ethan's voice was firm. "We didn't betray anyone. We refused to let hate dictate our lives." "You call this love?" Greg sneered. "You've turned us into a national joke." Emily's voice quavered but held steady. "We didn't turn anyone into anything. You did that yourselves, with the way you've clung to this feud like it's more important than family." Henry leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You don't understand what's at stake here. This feud isn't just about us. It's about history, legacy, honor." "Honor?" Ethan's laugh was bitter. "What kind of honor tears families apart? What kind of legacy is worth sacrificing the people you're supposed to love?" The room fell silent. Even Caleb seemed shaken by Ethan's words. "I loved Clearwater," Ethan continued, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't stay and watch it destroy us. I chose Emily because she makes me better, because she's worth fighting for. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the ones who've betrayed your families." Emily turned to her father, her eyes pleading. "Dad, I'm still your daughter. I'll always love you. But this feud, it's poison. It's taken so much from us. Please, don't let it take any more." John's hardened expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it. "This isn't about love," Greg spat. "It's about control. They're trying to control the narrative, make us look like villains." Frank, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "You don't need anyone to make you look like villains. The facts speak for themselves. The question is whether you're willing to let go of the past and start healing, or if you'll let your pride destroy what's left of your families." For the first time, Caleb spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Dad, he's right. This feud isn't protecting us. It's isolating us. Maybe it's time to let it go." Henry's head snapped toward his son, his eyes blazing. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I do," Caleb said, standing his ground. "Because I've seen what it's done to Ethan and Emily. And I don't want that for us anymore." The tension in the room seemed to shift, the weight of Caleb's words sinking into the silence. Ethan and Emily exchanged a glance, a flicker of hope passing between them. "I'm not asking you to forgive us," Ethan said, his voice softening. "I'm just asking you to let us live. To let us love each other without fear." Emily nodded. "You don't have to understand it, but you can respect it. That's all we want." The room fell into a tense silence, each person grappling with their own emotions. Finally, John Connor spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. "I don't like this," he admitted. "But maybe it's time we stop fighting." Henry looked at John, his jaw tightening. "You're really going to let them get away with this?" John's gaze shifted to Emily, and for the first time in years, his expression softened. "She's my daughter. I don't want to lose her." It wasn't an easy resolution. Words left unsaid still lingered, and the wounds were far from healed. But by the time the meeting ended, there was an unspoken agreement to try. As Ethan and Emily left the community center, the weight on their shoulders felt lighter than it had in months. "Do you think it'll last?" Emily asked as they walked hand in hand. Ethan smiled, his eyes full of hope. I don't know. But it's a start. Please like the video and subscribe the channel.